Oh, hi everybody. Sorry, it's hard to ski backwards. Anyway, I hope you're doing well. Wanted to chat a little bit about the exam first. You all did so well. I thought I'd make a fool of myself here on the ski slopes. It's very hard to ski backwards. Anyway, yeah, you did great, and I'm really happy. We didn't have the same sort of problem we had last year or last spring at least. You folks obviously had studied, and you did great. The average, I think, was about a 40, 39 or 40, which was amazing. And so for that reason, I didn't have to, do a huge curve. But again, what you saw there with the letter grades is just for the time being. I do not assign any letter grades until the end of the quarter when all the points are tallied up. It's just to give you a rough idea. So, we'll see how you do on the second and third exams, and then we'll determine what type of curve needs to be applied. But if you continue to do the way you did on the first exam, that's just the rough type of letter grade you can expect to get. Okay, let's see if there's any questions here. This is very odd. It looks like there's snow on my head, but not around me. Wow, this is fun. All right, let's see if there's any questions. Will there be a curve there? Yeah, I just described that, so that give you some idea, Mia. We're not assigning any letter grades till the end. When can I view what I got wrong? Oh, shoot. That should be available today or yesterday. It should have been available yesterday. You should be able to go back and see your exam now. And I thought that they sent a message automatically. So I apologize if I messed up on that. I will check it tonight. But I set it so that at the very latest Monday morning, everybody would be able to see which questions they got wrong and what the correct answers were. And that should, I thought you would get an email about that from iLearn. Has anyone else checked it? I can see. Okay, thank you. So Roya says that you can now see the questions you got wrong. The message says we can view it, but it doesn't give us that option. Aya, so you're saying you can't see what you got wrong on the exam? At least not for me. No. Okay. Go to the grades and click midterm one, then view submission, Roya says. And that should give you your own test, and I think, right? And then you can see what's marked wrong on that test. That's how I understood it worked in previous quarters, and I apologize if I did something wrong. I will check into that, but certainly within a day, at the very most tomorrow, I'll be able to make sure everyone has access to it. So I apologize if there was any issues with that. Okay, other questions? Other questions about the midterm? I do not know when the second test is yet. It depends on how quickly I can go today. We've been through TASTE, which is good. That's a piece of the second exam. But we also need to go through Touch, which we're going to be hopefully getting a lot to today. Okay. Do I know when the final is? Yes, the final, it will be during finals week. And I'll give you a range of days, just like I gave you a range of days for the first test. Okay, so sometime during finals week, probably around when the scheduled final time is, but I'll give you a range of days so you have some flexibility, just like you did for the first test. And you also will have for the second test. I just don't know that date range yet for the second and third test specifically, but don't worry, you'll have flexibility. How many questions on the final? It's the same. The question, okay, so a lot of the stuff is already on the syllabus and we've talked about, but the final exam has roughly the same number of questions as the second and third exam, which will be somewhere between, I guess, I don't know, 45 and 55 or something like that. And the tests are not cumulative. Thank you for reminding us of that, Roya. Okay, terrific. Then let's go back and discuss what we were discussing at the very tail end of the last class, and I realized there was a little bit of a technical issue with that. I think I fixed it. So what I'm going to do right off the bat, now that I'm going to change my silly look here. Ta-da! It's me. Okay, but we're still on the ski slopes. By the way, I understand that this kind of more frenetic, kind of fast-moving background doesn't really bother you folks, which is great. A lot of people liked it, as it turned out. So I'll leave it here. If it does bother you, let me know when I can change the background, but I guess it helped to keep people awake. Hey, I have hat head, which is hard given how little hair I have. All right. Oh, a few more chat questions. I'll be nice here. The tests are cumulative, correct? Will there be the same number of questions roughly on the exam? The same, yes, Ray. And no, Ava, as we said, it's not cumulative, so it doesn't consist of everything in the entire quarter. Oh, David says this background makes you feel like you're living a better life. Good for you. Maybe we will be able to ski this winter. Who knows? That'd be nice. It seems like a fairly safe situation to be in. You don't come very close to people. Let's see what happens. All right. Good. Then let's go ahead and share our screen, and I am going to just play a beginning piece of the movie I was going to show you last class. And just to remind you, we are talking about touch, but in a very interesting way. We're talking about touch in the context of plasticity. So I'm interested in understanding, oops, sorry about that. I'm interested in understanding what happens to touch when people lose another sense. Do they in fact enhance that sense of touch to kind of compensate? We've already seen a little bit of compensation, sensory compensation in our discussion of Daniel Kish and how he's able to use echolocation to kind of compensate for his blindness, and how his visual part of the brain, the part of the brain that usually is reserved for vision, actually helps him compensate with sound. Question is the same thing going to happen in a blind individual who improves their sense of touch for many possible reasons? And I'm going to introduce you to somebody here who has improved his sense of touch, named John Bramblett. And it's a long video. I don't want to show you all of it. I'll show you the important pieces. So hopefully this will work. Good.
My sight went very slowly at first. I didn't even realize it when I first noticed I was having trouble with my sight. I was already really twice over the legal limit for being blind. There were just less and less things I could do. I couldn't go out as much, or if I did, I needed assistance. There were just so many things I couldn't do. I just had a lot of anger building up. And I didn't even realize I was that angry, but I started painting. I don't know, so much as an outlet or a way of defiance in a way. It's something that is viewed as very visual. After a while, I started becoming less and less angry. The more I painted, the more I could let that out, and to where now it just I have to paint. Starting painting was sort of a crazy thing in a way. But I decided I just was going to do it. I couldn't write. I didn't have a computer at the time that could read to me. I feel like if I didn't have some sort of creative outlet, I was going to go crazy. I just needed to put something out there. In a way, it was out of anger. It was a way of, giving the middle finger to the universe or God or whatever you want to call it. Saying, well, I may not be visual, but I'm still going to do this. I'm still going to try. And I really didn't care what it looked like. I didn't care if it was visually appealing. I just wanted to do it. I thought the physical action of painting, of putting what's in my mind out there, actually in the physical world, even if no one else liked it, I wanted to create something like that. That's really what got me into it. And I went and got some oil paints and just started. I told my mom that I started painting, and she was like, "Oh, that's great." She was so worried when her and my dad came over one day, and she wanted to be so supportive. She didn't want to let me down, but she was so relieved when she looked at it. She liked it, and she actually liked it. reason I lost my vision is I have a seizure disorder. I've had it ever since I was a kid. The seizure will start in the front, and it'll hit the back where the occipital lobe is, because you actually see back here the optic nerve travels from your eyes around to the very back, so that my eyes work. I get light in, but the brain, the part that deciphers the image, doesn't know what to make with it. So it's sort of like a TV that you have on, but there's no signal, there's no antenna or cable or anything attached. So it's just it's just snow. It's just from the seizures, which is rare, it turns out. So, but if you have enough of them, it'll do it. The main problem when doing a painting, if you can't see it visually, is keeping oriented on the canvas and knowing exactly where you are and what you've done. I've always drawn using pencils or pens, but you can't feel pencils or pen strokes once you've put them down. And so I started using Elmer's glue because it dries and it's hard, but Elmer's glue takes about a day to dry. So whenever you make one line, you've got to wait about a day to go back and fill it again. So then I started using the whiteout pen, and that makes a very nice line that you can fill. But if you paint it on canvas, over time it seeps into the canvas, so your drawing will disappear. And now I used this stuff called slick paint, and it dries really, really fast. It doesn't disappear, it stays there, and you can fill it. And it orients you to the painting, and that's really all you need. That's all a person's eyes do whenever they're painting. Probably the next hardest thing was colors, but with oil paint, the great thing about oil paints is that they're all made with different substances, and it gives them a different viscosity and a different texture. The white, it almost feels like caulk or toothpaste. It's very thick, very viscous. And black is almost runny. It still has a thickness to it, but compared to white, it's almost like oil. If you were to mix half white and half black, the feeling and the viscosity is somewhere halfway in between. So you can just start working from there. Sometimes I'll decide on a color just because I like the way it feels. When I first started, I painted very slowly. I would make a small sketch and it would take me 8 hours to make one little sketch. I've sped up quite a bit. And part of it is just I can remember a lot more. Like whenever my hand goes over the drawing, I can feel the lines, and then I remember where they are, and then my other, over time I've learned to follow it a little bit more exact. One hand sort of to see the canvas, and the other hand to fill in the paint. It's hard to tell sometimes when you have a lot going on in a painting if it's actually working or if the colors are very good. It's nice to have an artist you go talk to, someone that you can talk to that you can say, is this actually the color that I was going for? And them to be able to say yes or it is or not. Does it work? Is this composition? Can you see what I'm kind of getting at here? And so the input's just invaluable.
It kind of gives it like.
Okay. Hope you found that interesting. He's a remarkable guy. So his name is John Bramblett, and he has a great website too if you're interested in looking at some of his artwork. Here, I've got some in the next slide. All that's his. You just saw some of them. And I realized I'd gone through some of this during the last class at the very end, so I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. For those of you that weren't here last class, you can go back and look at the video of that. But I wanted you to see the video. I the one I just showed you, I thought it was important. Just to remind you, he lost his sight. Pretty much he lost all of his sight by the time he was 25, and he had very little painting experience up until then. His mom was a hobbyist; she painted, but you know, he really hadn't tried it himself outside of, you know, a high school art class and things like that. So you saw his technique a little bit now. Again, what he does is he starts first on a small piece of paper, and he will draw the outline of whatever subjects he's going to paint, say a person's face, say that church, a doggy's face, using what he called slick paint in the video, but I think it's more commonly known as puffy paint. And it is a paint that, once it dries, actually leaves a raised line. So he does the outline of his subjects on a piece of paper using that puffy paint. He can then feel that to kind of make sure it feels like it should, based on what he's trying to depict. And then he will kind of transfer that by you know, having the piece of paper there taped to the wall, and feel that as he then kind of enlarges it and puts it on that big piece of canvas you saw him working on. That was a staple to the wall in his studio. So that puffy paint, he said that puffy paint, that slick paint sort of discovery was absolutely crucial to his technique. They tried a few other things, and it was messy, or you know, like the glue thing, the glue would flick off, and it took a very, very long time for him to let the glue sit and dry, and even then it wasn't very reliable. So the puffy paint works really well. It dries fast enough that after he puts it on there, after a few minutes, he can go back to the beginning of where he did that and feel those lines on the canvas, and then start painting in between the lines that, you know, using the colors that he think will nicely depict what he's trying to portray in the painting. And so what you saw him do actually is what he was doing when that video was taken, which involved kind of following the lines of the puffy paint with his left hand as he was painting with the paintbrush in his right hand, like that. And that worked well. It worked pretty well. I mean, it got messy, but it was a pretty effective way of doing it. And you can see this art that you're looking at there was done with that technique. So he's following the lines with his left hand and painting with his right hand, and filling in with these oil paints. Now, I think this was really interesting. We talked about it before I actually saw the video, and I'm glad it was actually depicted in the video. He knows which paints he's using two methods. First of all, he lines up the paints, you know, in an order that makes sense to him. Maybe, you know, brighter colors are on one end, darker colors are on the other end, whatever. But he often has to use a paint color that is based on a mixture of a number of paints. So he uses oil paints. And for those of you that have painted before with any regularity, you might know that oil paints kind of are awful to work with. They're messier, they take longer to dry. Acrylic is generally the sort of paint that people prefer, you know, if they're hobbyists, as an example. But he realized acrylics aren't going to work the way oil does for his specific needs, which is to be able to determine the paint he's using and the paint mixtures he's creating by feeling. So as it turns out, that oil paints, unlike acrylics, are all made from different sorts of chemicals. So to make a black oil paint, you use completely different chemistry than what you use to make a white oil paint. And that creates very different textures, of tactile textures, I mean touch textures, for the different paints, which is really useful for him. So say he wants to, you know, use a gray in a painting. What he'll do is he'll take some white and take some black, and he'll check to make sure they are in fact white and black by touching them. The black's very slick, the white's very pasty. And then he'll mix them together using a brush, and then he can tell roughly what shade of gray that is by how kind of slick versus thick it feels. If it's, you know, thicker towards more of a white, then it's probably a lighter gray. If it feels slicker, it's probably more towards a darker gray. And he does this, he has the same kind of technique for all the different paint mixtures he uses. So that's been a very, very useful thing for him to do. So it allows him for determining paint mixtures through touch, certainly. What else did I want to say about this? Yeah, so just to remind you, he does, I guess this is a little redundant, I've already said this, but he does feel the raised lines with his left hand, and then brushes the paints in between those raised lines. And you saw him doing a little bit of that there in the video. That's how he used to do it. He now has gotten so good, or even when I interviewed him, he was so good that he no longer, get this, he no longer needed to touch the line with his left hand. He could determine, okay, where the lines were by where the brush hit the line. So these lines are, very subtle. They are off the canvas. So yes, you can touch them. But to be able to feel the line with his brush is something he has learned to do from experience. Okay, so moving his brush up and down, it's like it catches it just a tiny bit. And that tells him, oh, that's the line. I need to, stop filling in the color there. And it's now also the same thing with paint mixtures. He no longer has to rely when he's mixing paint on touching the paint with his bare fingers. He can feel what the mixture is going to be like based on how the brush feels as he's kind of pulling it through the paint. So in other words, I used to have a brush here with all my little props sitting around my garage. I used to have a brush, but I can't find it right now. But you get the idea. Let's pretend this is a brush. When he's mixing the paint, how much effort he needs to put in to kind of pull the paint pull the brush through the paint is going to tell him something about the mixture he's created. If it's pasty and it's a light gray, then when he pulls his brush through the paint, there's going to be more resistance because it's more viscous, as he said. If on the other hand, it seems to glide through pretty easily after he's mixed together black and white, and it's kind of more, kind of slippery, then he knows he has a darker gray because it's more like black. And so no, he no longer has to touch the paint very much or the canvas very much with his hand. It's very messy, and he's learned to be able to be so sensitive with the brush that he can detect the paint mixtures and also the lines that are on the canvas as the brush is kind of, feeling the resistance of those different things. Thicker paints are going to induce more resistance, and that little line there is going to kind of feel like a little click when he hits it with the brush. So he no longer has to do this. It's really, he's really been surprised by how sensitive his brush hand has become to the point where he doesn't need to touch anything with his left hand. And this is a really, really interesting aspect of touch, and it's something we're going to be talking about later, but I wanted to first introduce it to you now. It's what I call at least, proxy touch. In other words, a lot of the touch we do turns out to be through tools, whether it's a paintbrush, whether it's a pen on a piece of paper. A pen is a tool that is allowing us to kind of by proxy touch paper through that tool. You've experienced these things when you've cooked, no doubt, determining how thick a soup is by how, as you mix the soup, it resists the spoon. If it's a thin soup, you'll be able to mix it easily. If it's a thicker soup, you'll have to, induce more kind of pressure as you move it around. All these examples are touch through a tool, whether it's a tool of a spoon, a paintbrush, or tools like hammers and screwdrivers and those sort of things. A lot of what we touch through tools as if that tool becomes an extension of our body. That's certainly the case with John Bramblett, and it will be the case in other examples we'll talk about later. A couple of other things I wanted to mention about John Bramblett. He paints from memory, like that church is painted from memory, and he also paints from models. And what you see there is the doggy face and the person's face. Those were painted from his pet doggy, which looks like a boxer, I guess, and his friend whose face he touched. And he says something very interesting. He said that, you might think that when it comes to, being able to capture a model, whether it's a person model, what I mean by model here is a person, something like, or fruit or something like that, it might be a hindrance to not be able to see it. But he thinks, in an interesting way, he's able to perceive more detail by touching what he's going to be painting. So by touching a dog's face, which is a complicated thing, a dog's face has a lot of different textures on it. I'm sure you've recognized this in dogs and cats. That little nosy is a little leather feeling, and there's kind of this wiry stuff coming out of the side of its mouth, and then fur and all that stuff. It's a complicated texture. And so when he feels the doggy face, he feels that he's getting more detail in some ways than if you could actually see it, which I think is a really interesting way of considering what we would typically think is a visual art, actually providing some touch experience as well. Okay. So based on that experience and his awareness, he's a very bright guy and he's very introspective. And he said, you know, that when I realized that touching your subjects, your models, and touching paintings could actually be a way of having a different perspective on art, I thought I had to share that, he told me. And so John has taught painting to both the blind and the sighted. And most of his teaching of the blind involves teaching blind kids. And you know, it's fun and stuff like that. But he's also taught sighted artists. And he's been brought into art schools, very serious art schools, where, you know, there's not any blind artists necessarily. Most of who he's talking to are sighted artists. And he'll always use this as a great example. I think it's a great example. He'll bring in an apple and he'll put it down on a chair in the middle of the studio and have the artists gather around it with their easels and say, everyone paint this apple. And, you know, everyone, you know, these are skilled folks, they'll paint it very quickly and say, great, thank you. Now I want you to look at each other's paintings and see how different are they from each other. And they'll look at them and there won't be a whole lot of difference. Certainly everyone's kind of getting a different kind of view, a different perspective on the apple. But they all, you know, kind of look like flat, you know, kind of portrayed on a two-dimensional easel of apples, okay? Then what he'll do is say, okay, let's all close our eyes and pass around the apple. And that's what they'll do. They'll pass around the apple and everybody will feel it with their eyes closed. Okay? Everyone take some time and feel it like maybe, I don't know, 30 seconds to a minute. Okay. Now, what I want you to do, he'll say, is go up to the easel, use a new canvas, a new piece of paper, and paint the apple that you felt. Okay, you know, we all know what an apple looks like, those of you that are sighted, but paint the apple that you felt. Try to capture the texture you felt. And everybody will do that, and then they will look at each other's paintings, and they will all be completely different, which is just fascinating, you know? He calls this the apple touch technique. He thinks this is such an interesting way to get artists to rethink their medium as something as more than a visual kind of, you know, channel, that you can also touch the subjects and get a very different kind of detailed understanding of it that will lend itself to a unique portrayal, one that just doesn't look like an apple, but also captures what an apple feels like. It's absolutely fascinating to me. Now, he's gotten some notoriety, and if you look on his webpage, you'll see he's able to support himself now with his paintings, and he goes around giving talks. I think he has a TED Talk somewhere. He teaches at schools. He teaches art to art students at colleges. So he's been successful, and he's gotten a lot of notoriety, as I said. And so he's been invited by art collectors to come over to their houses and touch their paintings. So you can't do this at a museum, I'm sure you know. If you were ever a kid and tried to touch a painting in a museum, you got yelled at, right? You can't do this in a museum. But when someone owns the art, you know, they don't mind if somebody touches it with clean hands. So he has had the opportunity to touch the paintings of Cézanne, and that's a Cézanne right there, Rembrandt, and that's a Rembrandt there, and Van Gogh, who you probably recognize. These, by the way, are Bramblets. This is a friend of his, and this is a street he remembers near where he grew up. Okay, but these are Cézanne, Rembrandt, and Van Gogh. And he said that when you touch these paintings, which are actually, were all created, as much as I understand it, with oil paints leave kind of little raised texture on the canvas because they are made of such unique materials. And he'll feel the paintings as he asks somebody to describe it to him. So it's not to the degree where, it doesn't have the puffy paint where he can tell what these shapes necessarily are. But he'll ask somebody, okay, what am I touching? What is the artist depicting here, and they'll say, oh, well, it's women, lounging, and it's, people having, I don't know, some sort of meeting. This is a field. So he will be told what the paintings are of, but he will touch kind of the details, and he'll be able to kind of, I guess, experience something the rest of us might not experience when we look at a painting. He says that he can clearly feel the brush strokes. I mean, he can feel how the brush strokes were actually made, how they occurred during the production of the painting. So, in something like this, the brushstrokes in this Cezanne, the brushstrokes might be a little bit more languid or smooth, going from one texture to another, something like that. Where when you touch a Van Gogh, especially down here or up here, or in Starry Night, one of his famous paintings, you feel a very different technique that Van Gogh used that might, in some ways, kind of give you some insight into the artist himself or herself. So you feel the oil down here, you feel these very kind of almost violent brushstrokes, where here things are much smoother, things are much more methodical, perhaps, much more languid, much more relaxed. But here it is, really kind of anxious brushstrokes. And so he feels that, because he's able to touch paintings like this and has experience touching his own paintings, both wet and dry, that he can tell something. He can get insight into the artist's technique and state of mind, okay, when they were painting, which is an absolutely amazing thought. Like, a painting isn't just a record of something that a person's trying to depict. It's not just a record of the field that Van Gogh is trying to depict. It's a record of the act of painting, and to some degree of the kind of internal psychological state of the painter as they were painting. It's amazing. I mean, it's just such an interesting way of thinking of art, and like floors. I'm sure it floors all the art students, and I imagine they'll go back and touch their own paintings if they have, oil painting, which leaves that type of texture to it. But to have that sort of experience, I mean, it's almost a more intimate experience with the artist and the artist's act than one gets from looking at paintings. Okay, let me take a couple of seconds here and see if there are any questions. Right. These are all old questions. Okay. Well, a lot of old questions, sorry. Okay, here we go. Does this have to do with brain plasticity? David, I'm really glad you asked me this question. It has everything to do with brain plasticity, and we're going to use him as an example to understand brain plasticity when it comes to touch. Roya said that she liked the video. That was so calming. I'm glad to hear that. Alex asks, would you think an ambidextrous person would have an easier time if they were blind painting, I assume, because they have a lot more experience with feeling with the non-dominant hand? That's a really good question. I don't know very much about ambidextrous individuals and whether they have equivalent touch sensitivity in the two hands. I mean, they certainly have, a more, I guess, balanced coordinative ability in the two hands. But whether they are actually more sensitive, because those of us that are right-handed are a little bit more sensitive at touch than our left hand, depending on, there's some qualifications of that, as you'll see as this lecture goes on. If you're a violinist and you're using your left hand on the neck, you have some sensitivity that your right hand doesn't have. But yeah, it's a really good question about ambidextrous individuals and whether they have a different kind of touch sensitivity. Yeah, good question. Yeah. So Kialani says that, so essentially the brush has become an extension of himself. That's a great way of putting it. And yes, we will talk more about that when we talk about the research that's been conducted on using tools and how the brain changes to actually kind of make room for that tool as if it was an appendage. Great question. Yeah, Ariel says a blind man is able to paint better than some sighted people. Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I would imagine that certainly not all blind people are going to be able to get to this level. I would think that there's some things going on in his you know, kind of home environment that helped, and maybe his genetics. You know, his mom was a painter, and, you know, successful enough to sell some paintings and that sort of thing. His wife, who you saw there in the video, is a painter, and she's giving him feedback, so that's helping a little bit too. So I don't know if, you know, any blind person could learn to be so successful as a painter, but it is amazing that he is so good. It really is. How does he know what color the object painting he feels is? I'm sorry if I might have missed that. So he doesn't in most cases. So that's a very good question. So you're suggesting, oh, the thing he's painting. Okay, so Paxton, you're asking, like, when he feels something, does he know? Oh, I'm really glad you mentioned that, and it's in the book. I mean, he knows. He used to see. He knows that faces are, you know, only a certain, you know, range of colors, and doggies have range of colors and stuff like that. He knows that to some degree. However, sometimes what he'll do is he'll feel a face, and depending on the texture of the face, can I quickly show you this? The texture on the face. Here, this gentleman down here, he'll feel the texture of the skin and say, "Wow, that texture. Yes, I know it should be, you know, a flesh color of one type or another, but that texture reminds me of the texture of a pink paint, or reminds me of the texture of an orange paint or a red paint." And so he will choose the colors, not necessarily based on reality all the time. Sometimes he'll choose the colors based on what the feel reminds him of regarding the colors texture, tactile texture themselves. So yes, he, you know, in some cases he does care that things kind of match up. But if you look through his art, and some of it almost seems kind of psychedelic, like we used to call that psychedelic art in the 1960s. It looks like that. It looks like it's you know, you can see the forms as you can see the faces, but it almost looks like it's color distorted intentionally. And in his case, he's kind of exploring colors a little bit, and, you know, he'll then, you know, feel the face again and feel the paints and try to match them. And he knows he's going to come up with something that's, you know, not the same color as reality. That's not that important to him. He really wants to capture, you know, how his experience of touch might be conveyed to the canvas, and then conveyed to everybody else through looking and potentially touching as well. It's a very good question, Mac. Really glad you asked that. Okay, okay. Let me tell you something. I messed up a little bit here. I forgot to make your practice questions. They have to be put into the Zoom website, and I just plain forgot. So I'm not sure what to do. I could give you twice as many next class, or I could read some off to you now. I'm thinking of doing twice as many this next class, because then you will have images of them on the screen, where if I just read them, you won't. So, okay, what do you guys think? Martin says twice. I prefer twice, 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 twice. Everyone says twice. That's great. Okay, thank you. I will give you 12. I'll give you 4. I usually give you 2 a class or so. I'll give you 4 next class, and we'll do them. You know, in the beginning, we'll do the 2 that should have been part of this class in the very beginning of next class. That's fine. I kind of thought you'd want that. Sorry about that. You can do it now and type into chat. You know what? That's good. I was thinking I could type them in now, and it's just going to take too long, Kennedy. Let's just do it so I can prepare them and just show them to you, and that will be the best thing. And I realize that it actually doesn't help the people who are going to watch the video later. They have to, you know, copy them down themselves, but that's okay. For those of you that are here, you get the extra special benefit of actually having an image of the question. So let's do that. Everyone's saying twice next class, so that's no problem. Okay. Then let's move on. And, oh, we already did this, talking about all of his experience touching painting. But we're going to move on now and talk about the science. So what happens when an individual goes blind or is blind from birth? What happens to a person's skills with touch? And it's long been known that a blind individual will be more sensitive with their touch. And there's lots of different ways of testing this. You know, there's I won't talk about them now, but I can talk about them later. But a lot of it has to do with how they test old people with touch, and it involves how far apart 2 little prongs need to be. Do I have any prongs here? Imagine 2 little pencil tips. How far apart do they need to be, say, on a fingertip, for somebody to feel that there's 2 pencil tips versus 1 pencil tip? Right? And if they're both going in the exact same spot, the 2 pencil tips, it'd be hard for any of us to say that's 2 pencils. But then you move them apart slowly, And for those of us that are young, like you folks, you can pretty quickly say, oh yeah, I can feel that that's now 2 pencil parts. But for an older person, it has to go further. And that's what touch sensitivity often is, how it's often tested. You know, whether you're touching 2 points or 1 point. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. But one thing blindness does is it makes an individual's sense of touch more sensitive to somebody their own age who is not blind. In fact, it really gives them a sense of touch that is about 25 years younger. So that's what this means here. It counteracts the aging decline. So what we know as we get older, probably me as well at this point, my sense of touch isn't exactly where it used to be. But certainly when you get into your late 60s and 70s and 80s, then your sense of touch isn't really great at all. By the way, there are some theories that that's why older people have more falls, is that their sense of touch on their feet isn't as good as it used to be, and therefore their balance isn't as good. So it could very well be related to that. But if an individual is blind and say they are 50 years old, and where their friends that are not blind have started to have that degradation in their touch sensitivity, a blind individual who's 50 would have the touch sensitivity of someone who's 25. And that kind of is maintained, that 25-year, that kind of youthful sense of touch is maintained. So when you're 75 and you're blind, you have the touch sensitivity of a 50-year-old person. So there is clearly this compensation that occurs. So why does that occur? Well, when you hear this story, you say, well, the blind use Braille, right? And that's what you're seeing here. I assume most of you know what Braille is, right? It's a raised dot, set of raised dot patterns that allow the blind to read, right? They're all over campus. For those of you that haven't been on campus yet, once you start going back to the lecture halls, knocking on wood here, maybe in spring, not in spring probably. Okay, maybe summer, certainly fall. You'll be back in the lecture halls, right? You'll go up to the, and look at the numbers of the lecture halls the first time you're there. Every single sign on campus for academic buildings and for laboratories, for restrooms, has Braille lettering underneath the visible numbers or visible name of the room or something like that. That's all over campus. It's a law. There are books for the blind that are written completely in Braille. There are certainly devices that will look at a computer screen and find its text, and then translate that text that's on a computer screen to a device that it has raised dots on it. So with one hand, the blind person will kind of move a cursor across the screen. With the other hand, they'll feel the kind of transformed letters that are transformed into the dots and be able to read it that way. Okay, so is that why? Is that why the blind have better touch sensitivity? And I'm going to tell you something about Braille that you might not know. I assume most of you have heard of Braille, but I didn't know this until I started actually doing research on this topic. Guess what percentage of the blind actually can read Braille? I always assumed it was going to be like, I don't know, 85, 90, maybe it's not as many as that can actually, sighted people that can read, but it's a very, very small number. It's 10%, and it's shrinking. Well, it's shrinking for an understandable reason. So that scenario I just gave you where, you can look at text on a computer screen and have it translated into Braille that a person could feel isn't really required anymore. And you probably know that. You can easily get your computer to read you the text that's on a screen. In an okay voice. The blind typically will spend a little bit more and have a nice synthesizer on their computer so the voice sounds natural. And any book, almost any book now that's, certainly, created over the last 25 to 30 years is created as an audiobook too. So, my book, is an audiobook. Actually, there's 2 versions of my book as an audiobook. One that I read, out loud myself. Got paid very little money for doing it. But then there's also a version that was done for the blind that they have special readers do. So even my stinky little book, has an audio version, and almost any other book that came out, regardless of how small, or as long as it's by a major publisher, an audio version. So pretty much any text a blind person now needs access to is available through audio, okay? Maybe except for signs that you would encounter. So most blind people don't use Braille, okay? Probably it's like 95% now don't use Braille. So what is going on? Why do they have this enhanced sense of touch? And the answer, I will say, is cross-modal plasticity, okay? We've talked about this term, the idea that the senses kind of compensate for each other. And we talked about it in the context of Daniel Kish, and now we're talking about it in the context of blindness and touch. Hey, we also talked about it a little bit when we were discussing blindness or being in a dark restaurant, that other sorts of cues for flavor and taste come into play if one can't see their food. We've talked about this a number of times, but we're going to get a little bit more formal about it now and understand a little bit more about the mechanisms that are involved in something. Okay, so let's first contrast it with what sighted people do. When you and I touch something, I'm going to get out my brain hat. Oh, my brain hat has seen better days. I should have made it out of a more firm material. Okay. When I touch something, how's my brain hat look? Not bad. Here, let me just pull my own image in so I can make sure I'm pointing to the right parts. Okay. Here, look at it here. Yeah. When I touch something as a sighted person, or you touch something as a sighted person, there's a little strip over here. Here, let me get closer for you. This little strip right here, it's called the sensory cortex, okay? We light it up. That's what we call, that's what on this slide is called the touch brain region. Oops. Okay. Look, I'm really messing up my brain hat. It makes me sad. Okay, when I say the touch brain region, that's what I'm talking about, that little strip over there. I think it said sensory cortex or something like that. Sensory cortex is just another name for touch brain region. Use touch brain region, it's much more intuitive. Okay, that's what happens when you and I touch something. Okay, we close our eyes, say, and we're trying to figure out what something is. Okay, I think this is a phone. There you go. And when I do that, my touch brain areas light up, this little strip. Okay. When the blind do it, yes, it is true that their touch brain areas light up, but their visual regions also light up. This part back here that we've alluded to a number of times, the visual cortex. John Bramblett talked about it in that little video. He said that there was seizures that were kind of finding their way all the way to the back, and that made it more difficult for him to see during the seizures and ultimately did some damage to his visual cortex. So as he said, all the information is getting into his eyes, but when it comes back to the visual brain area here, it's not doing its stuff. All right. And what happens then after a while with someone like John Bramblett is that this area gets dedicated to the other senses. And you already know this about Daniel Kish, right? He uses this area to help him have excellent echolocation skills. And blind people will also use this part of the brain, this visual cortex, to help with their touch skills. How do we know about that? I'm going to leave this hat on. How do we know about that? Well, in the old days, we knew about it based on brain lesion sorts of observations. So this is what happens. A blind person who can read Braille is able to do this for most of their life. And then in later life, they have a stroke. And the stroke induces a brain lesion in the visual cortex. Now, you would think, okay, so the blind person has a stroke and with damage to the visual cortex, it's not going to really be very evident in their behavior because they weren't using their visual cortex for seeing anyway. But it is evident in their behavior. When a blind person who reads Braille has a lesion, has damage to that part of their brain, they have trouble reading Braille. Okay? Now, other things are spared. Right, so their ability to recognize, say, shapes by touch, to recognize textures generally by touch, like you and I would, the texture of the computer, that sort of thing. But when it came to that complex touch, okay, the complex touch that's involved with Braille, which you're seeing right here, you can see that's very complex touch. That no longer works when the visual brain has been lesioned. All right. So that's a really that's a fairly compelling piece of evidence that the visual brain areas of people who've lost their vision can get rededicated to touch, especially complex touch. Of course, you don't have a whole lot of folks with brain lesions that are blind that touch Braille to do this. So what do? And what you do is you make use of a relatively new and amazing invention. And this invention, I'll give you the technical name, but I don't really care you and remember this, but I want you to understand what it does and how important it has been to psychology. Transcranial magnetic stimulation. Okay, I'm going to abbreviate it TMS, right? And what is it? Well, you are seeing a transcranial magnetic stimulator right there. So it kind of looks like he's wearing Mickey Mouse ears or something like that. And basically, it's like a kind of a tool, like a kind of it's this device that's hanging kind of from a what do you call it? Kind of a lamp end or something that allows you to move it around the head. Okay, it allows you can put this little set of mouse ears on the side of the head. It's not actually touching his head. It's hovering around his head. And the kind of arm that it's suspended from allows you to do that. What does it do? Well, basically, it kind of imparts a large but very temporary magnetic charge through the skull into the brain. Okay, well, it sounds dastardly, right? It isn't. I've had it done to myself. I've seen it done to other people. It does cause some change in experience, I would say, but nothing that's permanent. It doesn't last very long at all. But what it does, what TMS does, is induce a lesion. Just for a second. That's what I mean by transient lesion. Before when I was talking about lesions, I was saying that you have a stroke, there's permanent damage in this part of the brain or largely permanent. And you can study these folks, but again, you don't have a lot of those folks. So is there another way of doing it? And fortunately, yeah, there is. There is this device that basically shuts down, breaks a part of the brain that you would believe would be involved with something. This is cool. So this is, you know some of the modern techniques of brain imaging, see what's going on in the brain as somebody, performs a perceptual task or a mental task or something like that. This isn't a way to see what is happening inside the brain. This is not like a camera or an X-ray or something like this. This is a way of breaking very specific areas in the brain to see then how someone's perception, how someone's motor coordination is changed. And it is an amazing, amazing thing. It really allows us to do this sort of thing. We used to have to just wait for lesion patients to show behavioral differences, and then we used to have to wait for them to pass on so we could do autopsies to see exactly what part of their brain was broken. We don't have to do that anymore. We can break a person's brain. Sounds awful. We can break a person's brain for a very temporary time, less than a minute. Usually these things are, and then within a few minutes they're completely back to normal. Okay, so what happens? If you, in fact, swing these little mouse ears around to the side of the head, which is over this sensory strip. It's the sensory cortex here. It's the touch-sensitive part of the brain. If you, impart that strong magnetic pulse to this part of the brain, it does affect one's ability to touch. They typically have a loss of what we'd say is shape discrimination. Okay, so they would have trouble at that point saying that this is a rectangle or a square, or I don't know, this is a circle or an oval. They would be inhibited. They wouldn't be as successful at determining that through touch. Okay, so that's what happens when you temporarily break this part of the brain. But then what you do is you swing it around to the back in the visual cortex area to see what happens. So, and this is for individuals who are blind, by the way, I should mention. Okay, if you do this with visual region of the blind, what happens? Well, their shape discrimination returns. Okay, so they're no longer having this part of their brain broken, and now they can say, oh yeah, this shape is a circle, this shape is a rectangle, it's not a square. I can definitely determine that. But what they can no longer do is the sort of fine touch discrimination that would be like what they would need for Braille. Okay, these are even people. These are blind individuals who don't even know Braille. They might just have to touch a piece of plastic or cardboard that has these little bumps in it and say, are these 3 bumps horizontally oriented or vertically oriented? And when the back, they could normally do that without much problem, but when the back of their brain has been broken using this TMS technique, they are no longer able to do that, which suggests for the blind, they use, the regular part of their brain for using discrimination in shapes, for determining discrimination in shapes, and kind of more, I don't know, kind of general sorts of touch things. But when it comes to really having to determine what the kind of details of something they're touching is like, they use this part of the brain. This part of the brain helps them because it's the visual cortex that doesn't get input from vision anymore. It's lending itself to touch. Okay, does that make sense? Good. So let's see if there's some questions here before we continue. Okay. David said nice things about my book. Thank you, David. Roya says, why do so little blind people use Braille? So it is very difficult to learn. It takes a long time to learn. Sometimes blind individuals don't have access to the teaching that needs to be done. And of course, as I've said, Roya, as time goes on and more things are available as audiobooks or audio readers of computer screens, fewer and fewer people need it. I believe, so there are blind people on campus, and I believe most of the blind people I've encountered on campus do read Braille. But, the blind people, unfortunately, blind people that go to college is way too small, the proportion of blind people. For that reason, they might not feel like they need Braille given other ways of doing it. So, yeah, that's why. Alex thinks that TMS sounds scary. It does. But it is not that scary. And you might, if you look up TMS when you go home, when you're home, if you look at TMS tonight, you're going to find that it's used for very kind of positive purposes. So one thing that people have been using it for is to enable people that have serious depression to kind of get out of that depression. And you probably know a little bit about this story about shock treatment. That was, in the old days, that's what was used to kind of treat people's depression. And, it's invasive. That's very invasive. This is kind of in some ways like a more gentle way of doing it. So TMS it sounds brutal, but it really isn't. And, having done it myself, we don't have one on campus yet. We have kind of a low-grade version of it in one of my colleagues' labs in the psychology department that works not through this big magnetic pulse, but actually 9-volt batteries that do interesting things. And I've done that as well. I would not call the experience unpleasant. It is in no way painful. And, you feel, when you're asked to then perform different things, you realize, oh, I can't do that. I can normally move my finger that way, and right now I can't. And then within a minute it comes back. So it really isn't that big a deal. Does a sighted person's brain use the visual region when they're closing their eyes or in the dark? That's a great question, Roya, and we are going to address that in detail in just a second. And Teresa asks, can you explain again why a blind person uses more the visual side? Why do they use their visual brain? Is that the visual regions of their brain? Is that what you're asking, Teresa? Because the answer to that is because it's not being used for other things. And so, like as we discussed with Daniel Kish, that part of the brain that is usually used. Wait. Oh, okay. I forgot to change this clock. I almost fainted because I thought it was 7 o'clock. All right. The vacant part of the brain that's not getting input from the visual system, not getting usable input for the visual system, will kind of say, "Hey, what do I do? I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you hearing. I'm here to help you touching, and let me go ahead and do that." And that's going to be part of the basis, it's thought, of the compensation that you see in these individuals. So it's a great question and an important story. Okay. Let's continue. I know we're kind of going through a lot without many breaks, but you're asking good questions, so that provides a break. But I really like this experiment, so I think it's important for us to understand it in some detail. And you just asked a really important question, because who was it? Roy asked that question, I think, about what happens with sighted individuals when they are, closing their eyes or when they are blindfolded. Here's the answer. Now, this is serious blindfolding, and you can see how it's done here. This is a person who has big cotton swabs on their eyes, and then they're like some sort of bandage is bandaging their eyes. It's important they have absolutely no light vision. So this isn't just the blindfold you get, from the the airplanes, if they give you blindfolds, or maybe you've played with when you were a kid, when you played games at birthdays. It's not that type of blindfold where it's fairly easy to cheat. This is a blindfold that stays on a person very, very solidly for a long period of time. How long? Well, we're talking about 5 days of visual deprivation. So you yourself could volunteer for these experiments. I could volunteer for these experiments. What you do is you dedicate yourself to be in this important experiment for 5 days. And typically, back in 2010, when they were doing these experiments, they would check people into a hospital room, and that would enable them to closely monitor them, to make sure that they were getting the kind of training manipulation that was important for them. And as you'll see, it was important in this experiment that they be near an fMRI device and a TMS device. Okay, so these subjects did check themselves into the hospital for 5 days. Okay, and the first thing that's done when they get there after they're blindfolded is this fMRI. So this is functional magnetic resonance imaging. I'm pretty sure we used the term before. And this allows us to see pictures of the brain as you're seeing here. Actually, I think these are PET scans, but that's okay. The fMRI is the fancy ones that are color, and I think I've shown you examples of those. Those are really nice, kind of detailed images of the brain. Okay, so you get some sort of baseline. And then you look at that as you have them. You look at their brains as they perform a task for you. And it's the first time they're performing the task, and so it's going to be a little tricky. But the task is just raised dot discrimination. And for all intents and purposes, we can think of it like learning Braille. It is easier than Braille, because Braille has a different pattern of six dots, or 6 raised dots for different letters. It takes a long time. So the thing they're touching is like what you're seeing there. It's like Braille, but it's a little bit easier because Braille is very difficult. So they touch these things and ask, and they touch one, and then they touch another, and they're asked whether or not they were the same pattern of raised dots or different. And as they're doing that, they are scanned, and the scientists are trying to determine what parts of the brain are being activated as people who are newly blindfolded are touching things. Okay? That's the first thing that's done. The next thing that's done is every single day there is a training period of 6 hours. And they're getting more or less Braille lessons. Again, it's a little easier than Braille, which is why it says raised dot discrimination, but they are getting trained to become better at this task. So you can imagine doing this. You don't have a lot to do if you're blindfolded and sitting in a hospital room so 6 hours. Maybe it helps the time go by, and you get to interact with people and maybe make small talk in between the teaching of the raised dot discrimination training and all that sort of stuff, which is probably not terrible. And then at the end of each day, you get tested on what your brain is doing discrimination. So you get 6 hours of training after the first day, and then you go back into the fMRI machine, and you are asked to do the discrimination you were asked to do that very first day. And now they're looking to see what's changed in your brain. Now you might find it's a little bit easier even after a first day of training, because 6 hours is a long time. Okay, but the question is, what's going on in the brain when this happens? Okay. On the fifth day, all right, you get tested again for your MRI. They look at your brain as you're making these discriminations, but then they apply this wonderful TMS tool to see if whatever changes occurred to the brain and whatever improvements occurred with behavior if in fact that could be nullified, if that could be broken by applying TMS. Okay, so in a sense, what you're doing here is you're kind of doing a very short-term version of what happens with people who go blind or blind from birth. But can it happen within 5 days? You know, I forgot to mention one thing about this. You know, one of the first things you notice after you've been blindfolded for, say, an hour or two, or even less, is that food doesn't taste like it should. Food tastes more bland. And I mentioned that there were experiments that showed that to be the case, that when people are systematically blindfolded, it's one of the first things they notice. And you think, oh, it's hospital food, it's terrible. No, but to kind of compensate these poor folks who were blindfolded in a hospital room for 5 days, they got to bring in their own, order their own food and stuff like that, and say, geez, I love this pizza usually, but it tastes especially bland today. Are you sure you ordered from the right restaurant? It was that sort of thing. So just as kind of looping back into our taste discussion, I think that's very interesting. This is the sort of context where people really lose their sense of flavor. Comes back slowly over the 5 days, but 5 days is probably not quite enough for the other compensatory tricks to allow for the makeup of not being able to see the food. Anyway, that's an aside. Let's go back to the real question at hand. Okay, what happens as a result of 5 days of blinding, and what happens as a result of touch practice to the brain and to skill to some degree? Well, here's what they found. Okay, after a short period, the touch learning that occurs does start to activate visual brain areas. Okay, so it doesn't happen on the first day before the training, but as the training happens, okay, you start to, and not only the training, but also longer visual deprivation happens, you start to see the visual cortex in these very newly and shortly blind individuals helping with the discrimination. So that's one of the first things that you see. That then increases over the 5 days. By day 5, these individuals are absolutely using a bunch of their visual cortex when they're touching. They're also using everything, the same area that all of us use, the touch areas of the brain. But now, after 5 days, boy, are they using the visual cortex. Okay? Now, this is important. I didn't give you the full story because I didn't want to disappoint you, because you're in the group that had to be blindfolded for 5 days and had to get the 6 hours of training every day. And I'm sorry, you get paid a little bit more, but not a lot more than some other groups that were in the experiment. All right. There's another group in the experiment that they were not blindfolded, and they did not have to go into a hospital room, but they did get the 6 hours of training every day. They had to sit there, and I think they were told to look away, or maybe they were blindfolded during the actual training time, but they were not consistently blindfolded. They had the 6 hours of training every day. What do you think happens to their visual brain involvement? As it turns out, it's not as much. Okay, yes, after 6 hours a day of training, their visual brain is involved, but not nearly as much as you folks who had the touch training, the 6 hours a day of training, and the blindfolding. Okay, your visual brain was much more involved. Okay, there's another group I didn't tell you about, the group that's over here. Okay, they are only blindfolded. They're in the hospital room, but they're only blindfolded. They did not have to go through the 6 hours of training like you folks did. Sorry, you guys got $100 more. Sounds excruciating, but it's good for science. But there's this group over here that just sat in the hospital rooms, and they listened to music and they talked to people and stuff like that, but they didn't get trained on touch. Do you think their visual brains are involved later when they are asked to make discriminations? And the answer is yes. In fact, they are as good at touch as you are, even though they weren't trained, and they have their visual brain as involved as you do, even though they weren't trained. Which is a really interesting concept, because you say, oh, of course I'm getting 6 hours of training, that's going to change my brain. And certainly training does change the brain, but when it comes to the visual areas, kind of taking over for touch and helping with touch, You don't need that sort of intensive training. As if as if the brain is saying, I got nothing else to do. I want help. I want to help somebody else. And the touch system says, hey, you can give me a hand. Maybe you can help with this discrimination I'm asked to do for a few minutes every night. And by the fifth day, the visual brain is active even without all the training. And then finally, this TMS thing, okay? What happens to you and actually that group, the group that didn't get the training but got the blindfolding, if when you're touching things at the end of the experiment, you are given that TMS pulse, the little Mickey Mouse ears are swung to the back of your head, you're asked to touch things like Braille, and that TMS is turned on like that, guess what happens? You lose your touch skills. It is reduced. You become worse at your ability to discriminate Braille-like forms if your visual area back here has had a TMS lesion induced, temporary lesion induced. Okay? So, what can we learn from this? All right. What we can learn is this important point. Visual deprivation allows your visual brain to enhance your sense of touch. It's not dependent on training. Surprisingly, I think, right? I mean, I think that would have been my intuition that, this group that's blindfolded and getting trained is going to have much more visual involvement and potentially going to be better at this task. But it's not the case. That group over there that never trained 6 hours a day, but had the visual deprivation, their visual brains got rededicated to touch kind of on its own without all that training, which is really, really interesting. It really speaks to this kind of process of cross-sensory plasticity or cross-sensory compensation kind of happens on its own without the need for there to be intensive training to recruit the visual brain to help with touch. It's going to say, again, I think the way I think of the metaphor that I think of is like the visual brain just saying, hey, I want to help. I got nothing else to do. I'm bored. I don't want to get in trouble. When I get bored, I get in trouble, right? So hearing, what can I do for you? Touch, what can I do for you? And they say, well, as long as you're not busy, come over and help, even if there's not a lot of training necessary for it. Okay, let's just finish up here with kind of showing you some other examples that I think you'll find interesting of this, and are much less, I guess, burdensome when it comes to what we ask subjects to do. That 5-day thing, you don't need it. In fact, you can blind somebody for 3 hours and find that they become more sensitive to touch. Okay, even if they have no practice with touch during that time. So they have to do this in kind of an odd way, but they'll blindfold somebody, and then they'll tell them to take their hands and just drape them over the arms of the chair so their fingers aren't touching anything. Okay, so they're not having any experience of touch. So it's not like they're feeling the arms of the chair and maybe that's inducing changes. No, their hands are just floating there. And then they are asked to touch grids, and these grids are actually another way of testing, the touch sensitivity of, say, the elderly or something like that. What you do is you apply a little pressure. You're looking at a little plastic piece from the side. You can apply a little pressure with that plastic piece, and it can be done very accurately. That's what this is showing here. It looks like a torture device, but it's not. It's a way of applying, different amounts of pressure to the skin of the finger with these on the tip, okay? And in this particular experiment, they were asked whether the pressure, this little plastic device was oriented kind of vertically on the finger or across the fingertip horizontally, okay? And what they found is that individuals who were blindfolded for just 3 hours had better touch sensitivity even though they had no more experience touching things while they were blindfolding. So it's the exact same story here, and it's in a much easier experiment. So if you're thinking about doing this weekend or maybe over Thanksgiving with your siblings, this is the one to do. Don't blindfold them for 5 days and put them in a hospital room, okay? And then another question that bears very much, I think it was on Roya's question, concerning everyday touch. So do we, in fact, as sighted individuals, ever make use of our visual areas without being blindfolded for, say, 3 hours? And the answer is yes. Sometimes we do. So there are instances of everyday touch that probably recruit visual brain areas. And the example I like to give, I think probably is the most intuitive for people is, like if it's dark and you're going home, you're going back to your apartment, and you didn't turn the light on. What you want to do is put your hand in your pocket, like you're seeing that person do there, and find your house key by touch. Right? I do this all the time. I think I can determine which is my house key by touch. It is shaped a little bit differently, and it has ridges that I've gotten used to over time. When we do something like that, when we use kind of very precise touch to perceive the spatial kind of detail of an object, like our house key, and we're not looking at it, we do induce activity in the visual brain for that very brief amount of time. Okay, it's not to the extent, it's not to the duration somebody would who's been blindfolded for 3 hours, 5 days, or blind for part of their life. Okay, it's not the same level of recruitment, but it doesn't last as long, but it does recruit the visual brain when we are in that situation. So the next time, you're doing that type of thing, as you're going home in the dark and you're trying to find your key, you say, oh, my visual brain right now is active, even though it often is not for touch, right? It's usually this part over here that's active. There are instances, and that is one of the instances, okay? And we know that from both fMRI and TMS evidence, where you can image the brain, or you can break the brain while somebody is image the visual brain and show activity as somebody is touching something like a key and asked to pick out a key from a key set. Or you can TMS the visual brain and find that people are not as good at that type of task. So it is likely that in that context, yes, we do, all of us, use our visual brains to help us touch things that for the purposes of fine spatial detail. Okay. So I think that the take home here is, and then I'll have the time to answer some questions. I think the important concept that from all these slides is the following: that cross-sensory plasticity is not just something that happens to blind brains after a long period of time. It's something that happens to all of our brains. And here's an instance where it can be shown to happen with 3 hours. That's pretty significant changes in brain sensitivity. 3 hours of being blindfolded, even without touch experience, helps our sense of touch because of visual brain involvement. And then when we're touching keys, without being able to see them, we are probably making use of. So this idea of cross-sensory plasticity I have discussed most often in the context of the visually impaired or sensory impaired. It is a strategy of all brains, not just the sensory impaired, which is a really, really kind of important thing for us to be able to understand now and then take with us throughout the rest of the quarter as we start to understand how the senses kind of combine to work together. Okay, let me stop here with the lecture, and I've got just a couple of minutes to answer some really quick questions here. Do they teach Braille at schools for the blind? Typically they do. Not a high proportion of blind individuals necessarily get to learn at schools for the blind. There's a lot of people who live in rural areas that are blind that don't have access to those schools. It's a good question, David. Ariel asks, did this affect their sleep cycle? Oh yeah, the being blindfolded, it did. It did, and I can't remember how they helped with that. They did certain things that would help the sleep cycle. I don't know if they gave melatonin or something like that. It's a great question. Love the brain cap. It looks like a key pod. Absolutely, Roy. Thank you very much. It's I know it's a sort of religious headwear. I have to wear it whenever I go to somebody's bar mitzvah. Thank you. Andrea says, so after the experiment, does the brain return back to its regular state? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention that, Andrea. Absolutely. The people go home. They take off their blindfolds. They go home. And within days, the visual brain is no longer used for fine touch discrimination. Great question, Andrea. It's a very important point I forgot to say. How old were the participants? I think they're college students or maybe graduate student age, something like that. They're all young. Mustafa. Conway asked, do we have a better touch sensitivity after waking up from an 8-hour nap? That's a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that because our eyes are closed, right? I don't know that because so many other things are going on in the brain when we sleep. Sleeping might be so the visual cortex is certainly being activated at that point too. It's a very different experience. Sleeping is a very different experience from having visual deprivation from a blindfold. So it might not be true. Good question. Maham asks, according to the experiment, shouldn't more blind people use Braille? You would hope, but for whatever practical reasons, it's sad that it's not the case. Batul asks, wouldn't it involve the visual brain because we access the visual brain all other times we could see the key? Oh, that's a great question, Batul. So are we accessing our visual brains when we're touching our key because we've seen the key before? Yeah, imagining the key after we've seen it many times might play a role, and it's a complicated story. Good question. Faith asks, how come we're using the visual cortex instead of the sensory cortex when feeling something in and out? We're using our sensory cortex too. We're using the touch cortex as well, Faith. It's a good question. Sorry about the poll, David. I didn't have them today. Okay, well, quickly, does this mean that we have the lights off? Our sense of touch is enhanced. If we have the lights off, Maham, for enough of a period of time, our sense of touch will be enhanced, kind of more systematically with visual brain involvement. But it has to be off for some period of time. We might be able to attend to touch a little bit better, but that doesn't mean that the visual brain is helping at that point for a shorter period of time. Okay, Roya, very funny, Roya. And then finally, not an important question, but do you know where your background is from? Me? Yeah, I'm from upstate New York. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and my parents from New York City. Okay, sorry, gotta go. I pushed the time. I'm sorry. Have a good weekend. Wait, it's not Thursday. No, it's Tuesday. I'll see you on Thursday, everybody. Bye.